Hi everyone, and welcome back to Project No Buy. In today's video, we're going to discuss one thing that I wanted to buy but didn't, and it's kind of going to be an exploration of clothing and clothing prices, aided by the support of these two books, Fashionopolis and Overdressed. Okay, so getting right to the thing that I wanted to buy but didn't, and I have worn the equivalent of this item incidentally. So what happened is we periodically go to Costco, and it's one of those big box grocery stores where we buy food and other supplies, and we have a relatively large family, so it works for us. It's very practical. They also have clothes, and they oftentimes do what I would consider dupes of trendy items. And on that particular Costco run, I ran across an example of this exact sweatshirt. And this one is from a more high-end brand. Again, just for the sake of this conversation, because it's pertinent, I will share that it is a Lululemon sweatshirt. And the Costco version was a pretty dead-end dupe. Dead ringer? What is the word? It was like identical, right? And the only difference was that it had a hood. So it was like a hoodie, whereas this one just has a collar. It had the thumb holes, it had the little elastic on the zipper, it had the pockets, it had everything. And the Costco one was $14.97. So $15 for the Costco version of this sweatshirt that's probably 80 or 90 or possibly even more dollars. The point is, Costco has a $15 dupe of a very expensive sweatshirt. And it got me back on the justification train. It was like, oh, I already have this and love it. This one's gonna wear out at some point. That one has a hood, it's $15. And I actually, at this point in my life, would prefer to status signal the cheap one over the expensive one. I would rather represent the Costco dupe than the Lululemon designer one. And for all of these deranged reasons, I was there in the Costco holding this sweatshirt, lavender identical color, and thinking, maybe I should buy this. Maybe this would be a wise decision. Maybe I could justify this, and maybe not for the purposes of a no-buy year, but for the purposes of an ordinary purchase. And a slippery slope, right? This is why I'm doing this project. This is why I'm making these videos, because I want my life to look like a project no-buy. Maybe not an extreme no-buy year, like I said in the last video, I think, but a life where the mantra is that we don't buy things if we don't need them. Did I need another version of this sweatshirt? No. In my universe, you've seen my wardrobe, or I've done a whole wardrobe try-on this channel. I'm not monetized if you watch this, because I used music that's not available for monetization, so I don't share this repeatedly to try to get some more pennies on that video. I have done the wardrobe try-on to show that I have enough clothes, both for the world at large and to myself. I'm showing myself these things with the creation of this kind of trail of stuff, of consuming, of changing my habits on this channel. And so I know that I did not need an identical purple sweatshirt. I know that's not a need, and we don't need it, we don't buy it. That's the mantra here. And again, April's subject was supposedly the lost art of doing without. This isn't even a scenario that I would have had to do without something. I already have one. And so it becomes even more ludicrous for me to consider bringing in another one, bringing in what could be a backup one, bringing in what could even be maybe an inferior quality one. Although, that's dubious, because probably a lot of these things are made in similar factories or similar situations, or, it's not even a guarantee that Lululemon uses the same factories each time. And it's just a big kind of unknown as far as whether you can count on brands to be a certain level of quality these days, as we have probably all experienced. So anyway, that was a moment of deeply irrational desire to buy the cheaper version, the Costco dupe of something I already have. And it's kind of funny that part of the reasons that I wanted to buy it are also the reasons that maybe I wanted to have the nicer one before, right? Because I wanted to signal the absence of logo. So it's almost like I've done that 180 or almost a 360, except I am now doing the same justifying for different reasons, right? Instead of saying, oh, I want to have the logo, the nice one that everyone has, I want to fit in because all the cool girls have Lululemon and I want to have it too. Now I'm saying, oh, I want to be a conscious consumer. I want to show people that the cheaper one is just as good and can be just just as cute. I want to show people that I would rather spend $15 than $80 on a sweatshirt. Like, that's the signaling that I'm trying to accomplish through my clothing. And it's a trap that I can fall into through the other end of this tunnel, right? I can enter this tunnel both ways, and I'm not doing it. I didn't do it. I'm happy to report. Yay! But I was dangerously, maybe not dangerously close, but let's just say dangerously close as far as actually thinking about it there in the store. I did actually, okay, in my journal, I must have been dangerously close at the time. And looking back, maybe I don't feel it, but in my journal here, I did actually say that I also thought about reselling this one in order to have that one be the one that I had. So the justification wheels were turning over time, turning quickly. And, you know, selling this one would probably cover the cost of the new one. And then I would be able to represent the dupe culture, the thrifty kind of, you know, not thrifting literally, but being a little more conscious of the budget and those kind of values in the version that I currently had. It's also how I used to operate in the revolving door system of my wardrobe, right? Reselling something, thrifting something else, reselling it if it didn't work out, using the credit to buy something else on the thrift apps. You know, like, it's a cycle that I was all too familiar with, and I still was using up until very recently to try to offload some of my clothing purchase regrets. So really trying to close that revolving door. And just like I had that moment of reckoning with the lotion containers in January, I had that moment of reckoning for how I wanted to project this certain image through the version of lavender sweatshirt that I have. Incidentally, I watched a couple of videos of the New York City influencer scandal, right? I think that's been a talking point for commentary channels recently, how they're all the same. And I saw some examples of their TikToks on those YouTube videos. And I discovered that the facial moisturizer I got at Costco a while ago is actually something that they've been influencing. And so again, I'm kind of mad about that because I would rather not be using the facial moisturizer that the New York City influencers are talking about in their videos. But again, I'm not throwing it out. I'm just observing this and feeling a little bit of that kind of, I don't know, like shame. I don't know what it is. A feeling of like regret or silliness, like I've been fooled, you know, like I'm just trying to live my life and buy things in a more responsible, intentional way at stores that are local to me, even if Costco's not a great corporation, but like it's better than ordering things online. It's better than cycling through a lot of different options. And here it's still an influenced product. And it's just, I can't escape being part of this system, apparently. It was just a feeling of ugh. But to bring us into the conversation about clothing a little more and kind of the other train of thought that I got on considering the Costco clothing. And, you know, part of this is because I was reading these books in March and kind of churning over the thoughts. And I had read these before, right? These are rereads. It's amazing how different these books feel after actively trying to no-buy for a year and a little bit, a year and a third, or whatever it is, and how much more direct the things in these books feel to somebody, I guess, who's actively contemplating every single shopping decision. And it's not that I didn't absorb what was in them before, right? I had the knowledge in the back of my mind about, you know, the sweatshops and the factories and the, I guess, some information about the global supply chains and how things work like that and the cost of clothing and what's happened to make it so cheap and all these things, you know, but I guess I didn't have as good of an understanding. And, you know, part of that could just be that I'm however many years older now than when I read these the first time, and maybe I'm just wiser, I don't know. But I do think a large part of it is because I'm actively contemplating everything I buy and questioning it for every angle, from every angle that it can be questioned. You know, like, why is it $15? Why do I want it? Why do I want the logoless one? Why is the logo one $90? You know, like all these things, all these questions really give a different context to these books. Basically, in these books, it talks about the cycle of clothing, how they're made, how they came to be made in factories overseas, you know, how it used to be that clothes were made much more locally. There used to be more factories in the US. It used to be a case of people being paid a lot more fairly, or, you know, clothing used to be a good job is something that was in one of these books. It used to be a great job. Sewing should be a good job, a great job. I think that's one of the chapter titles in one of these. And it is now not. It is now a job that sometimes people who have no other choice will take, and something that was actually heartbreaking. So I think I talked about this in an earlier video, and I said I would revisit it later. So this is me revisiting it later. So I got that comment about how I've never been to a poor country, so I don't know how these things can work. And people in those poor countries want to have that job rather than no job. And so we should keep, conscious consuming is not the answer. The fast fashion companies are actually employing all these people. And again, these books provide a bigger context to that. And one of these books, I think Overdressed, says directly that this is a misguided narrative that a lot of us are told and believe in the Western world, or whatever it is, North America. And we are told that we're providing jobs in these less developed countries is what the narrative that we're kind of fed, the global South. And therefore, it's not a bad thing to use this cheaper labor. Things cost less over there. So if we pay them less, it still can be a living wage. Spoiler alert, it's not. It's not a living wage. And the people should be happy to have those jobs, or the people are happy to have those jobs because otherwise they wouldn't have any other job to do. And heartbreakingly, there is some truth to that. And I think maybe it was Fashionopolis, both of these books kind of address that. And in one of these books, they actually did share that some of the people in those jobs were hoping that people in the developed nations or whatever, they use different terminology in these books as well. They were written not yesterday. So I apologize if I'm using outdated terms, in other words. But the people in the global South, or whatever the preferred term is today, in some cases, they do hope that people in countries that consume fast fashion keep making those orders so that they still have work. And it's heartbreaking to think about that. The other point of that in Overdressed was that these companies that make the fast fashion pieces could afford to pay their workers more without passing much of that on to the consumer. That was the point that Elizabeth L. Cline made in Overdressed. Sorry, I didn't share the authors of these books yet. I'll share them in the description. Overdressed is Elizabeth L. Cline, and Fashionopolis is Dana Thomas. But, this comment that I received on that video about how poorer countries need these jobs clearly bothered me. It clearly didn't sit right. And, these books kind of gave me the tools to realize that it is something that shouldn't sit right with anybody. And again, I really don't want to call out the commenter because it makes some kind of sense, right? Like, it's a logical kind of conclusion. These countries have lower costs of living, lower strengths of their dollars, or whatever it is. And I don't understand global economics, so I can't tell you why. I know that it's not good vibes, right? Like I was sharing in the crunchy video about how crunchy we could be or whatever. If something's not good enough for one country, it's probably not good enough for any country. If it's not good enough here, it's not good enough to be doing in India or whatever. And that's a narrative that's very present in the book, The Story of Stuff, which is another one that I'm almost done with. I'm reading that in April. It's one of my April reads, and rereads, rather. Again, I've already read that, and it's shocking how different it feels to read it the second time after doing more of this work. So again, I'm sure I'll talk about that later in May or something like that. On the docket is The Story of Stuff, Consumed, and The Day the World Stopped Shopping. There we go. But anyway, all these narratives, the fact that these companies could be paying their workers more, could be doing more to ensure safety of factories, obviously the more they do of that, the less they can pocket for their own profits. And in some ways, it's still that kind of competition. And if we're competing to offer the cheapest price, that's always going to be a consequence. There's always going to be compromises wherever compromises can be made. And unfortunately, the compromises often consist of wages to real people in other places, but real people in these poorer countries that have to suffer or have to not be provided with what they need for the work that they do, in other words. And there's just something that's deeply unfair about that. And again, I'm not saying that this doesn't happen at all in North America or America, United States, whatever. I'm not saying that it's all fair and above board here. But I am saying that these companies that have huge customer bases in America, in the UK, in Australia and New Zealand, in, I guess, Europe as a whole. There are kind of statistics in these books about the consumers of fast fashion. I guess Asia is a growing market, or was a growing market at the time of these books as well. They're kind of getting to the same levels of consuming in the US. I think China as well was a really big growing market for consuming fast fashion. So all these countries that consume fast fashion and therefore kind of outsource the labor to people that aren't being provided what they need to live a decent life through the work of providing the labor for those fast fashion clothes. Like, it just isn't right. And we need to make it stop. We need to not be okay with it. Clothing should not actually be that cheap is another point that came up in these books. So clothing should not be cheap and disposable, even if it is produced at low wages and sold for low prices. And the Lululemon version of this sweatshirt, just briefly going back to that, may or may not have paid their workers more than the Costco version is the other thing, right? Part of the thing with the brands, I guess, is that brands are marketers. They market the product. They don't make products. And this is kind of pulling from the story of stuff, so it's a little bit of a preview. So the brand Lululemon is just a marketer. They created a vibe. They created an aesthetic, something to sell, and they don't make the products themselves. It's factories that are capable of making the same, the Costco version versus the Lululemon version. I don't even know. It could be the same factory for all I know. And I don't know if there was any more spent on the materials for this one versus that one. And I don't know if there was any more spent on the labor. I don't know if it was made in this country or that country. I could check labels maybe, but my point is that the cost of the item on the consumer is possibly no reflection of the cost to make the actual item. And it's certainly not going to be the cost differential that it's marketed to be, right? The brand name one is probably not paying their workers whatever $80 more, if you break that down, is worth to the laborers on the other side, the factories, as the $15 one, right? There's just so much less markup. And again, some of that is, I guess, the economy of scale, which is the fast fashion model, where so many pieces are sold and they rely on selling so many pieces, right? So it's a premise that has to have overconsumption in order to function. And without that overconsumption, without people buying more than they need and treating it as disposable, it just doesn't work. And so that's kind of where the Costco version fits in, because Costco sells so much stuff, so many things, that I guess that's how they can afford to take so much less of a markup on their version of this sweatshirt. And again, I don't have the information for how much Lululemon sells versus how much Costco sells of the exact same item. That would be interesting. Unfortunately, this is not a high quality research-based YouTube channel, so you're not going to get that here, at least not today. But it's one of those things to think about, right? Where the brand names and the markups that you get compared to very similar items, the dupes, as you will. And, sometimes the quality is not the same. I will agree with that, or that is my opinion. And this is not a blanket statement. I'm not saying that the dupe versus the original is the right choice in all scenarios for various reasons. And some of that can be that you just want to have the brand. Like, I'm not against that either. And I might be going through a phase where I'd rather have the unbranded one over the branded one, but that doesn't mean that I think that that's the right choice objectively, or that even if you care about having a brand of a thing, that you can't be a conscious consumer. I think you can have the conscious set of things that you prefer, whether they're branded or not. And the most important thing is if you treat them as non-disposable and kind of forever pieces and are responsible as much as you can be for the whole life cycle of the product. And, I guess that's the struggle, is that we cannot be responsible, or we have limited ways to share what we would prefer to see and get it from the factory production side, right? Like, I can't, there are some manufacturers of clothing where I know the whole life cycle of the process, and some of them were mentioned in these books, like some of the items on my wish list for March, right? One of those items was a local or American brand that is very open about their supply and their labor, and they have labels in the clothes with the name of the person who actually sewed it for you. And so, there are some smaller brands with more expensive offerings. It's got to be said. Clothing should not actually be cheap if everybody's being paid fairly. And it's frustrating that we can't equate more expensive with fair wages, is maybe one of the huge hard-hitting points here, right? That would be great if we could do that, but unfortunately it takes a lot more to ensure that we are participating in a more positive supply chain. And again, I'm not trying to say we need to take away the jobs of the fast fashion workers. We just need to make them into better jobs. And I don't have the answer for how we can personally do that, or how the world global supply chain could do that, but that's, I'm getting mad about it. I'm getting impassioned about it. And, I can't participate when I have other options in that kind of cycle of cheap labor and horrible working conditions. One of these books was sharing about, the stories directly from the Rana Plaza disasters, from people who survived. And there's a story of a man who fell down, the building collapsed. And so he fell down multiple stories of the building. And when he opened his eyes, he saw the face of his friend who worked multiple floors down in front of him, and his brains were coming out. And so it's like, it was literally like a war zone in this clothing manufacturing factory, this plaza of different factories, right? So it's not supposed to be like a war zone to just go to your job, right? It's not supposed to be putting your lives in danger, putting yourself in the line of possibly losing your life. It's just not supposed to be like that. And not to mention that the survivors of that have to live with this long-term trauma now and continue to function and work some kind of job and support their lives going forward. Like, it's indefensible, honestly. I also got a comment, abruptly switching gears here, on one of the videos that I did about the expensive jeans that I am incidentally wearing today. So they are getting their use. I got a comment on one of those videos about how me saying that Levi's are the $50 kind of average midpoint jean was wildly out of touch. And I have to share that I have been validated in Overdressed that shared the stories. The author quotes that exact figure for the $50 price point of Levi's jeans. Again, coming down from a more expensive price point where they were better made, more premium, more local in some cases. But that exact figure was in this book, Overdressed. And so if I was wildly overtouched with my quoting that, again, I had read these before. And so it wasn't that I was pulling that out of thin air. I do also remember them being more expensive in New Zealand. And so I see both sides of the picture, right? Maybe it is still wildly out of touch for some areas of the world, but I just wanted to share that when I said Levi's were kind of the $50 reasonable price point for jeans, I was taking that from an exterior source. I wasn't just pulling that out of my own ignorant brain. The author of Overdressed was also saying that more designed clothing with kind of unusual patterns and brands that have designs that are kind of exclusive, so they're not really made in the same way anywhere else, will be much, much more expensive. The book specifically said that these kind of pieces will cost hundreds of dollars, but will be less than the likes of Prada and other designers. And so, again, there stems some of the justification for my wildly expensive hundreds of dollar pants because of their unique design. I don't think there's any other brand that makes pants that are exactly like these ones. I know there are other balloon style jeans or whatever, bare leg style jeans, but there are none of them that have all the design features that I've seen on this one. And so I am paying for that design, not to make this whole channel about some ridiculously expensive jeans. But this is where my narratives were coming from. When I made that hour-long video, this is the knowledge that I was pulling from, having read these books before, that clothing should not be cheap. No, I should not have bought so much of it in the course of my clothing buying life. But I stand behind the $500 jeans, or the ones that I paid $415 or whatever it was with the discount for, and I stand behind them. I'm going to wear them until they cannot be worn anymore. And I am happy to have paid for the design. Maybe that's a hot take, but I understand that they had to cost more because of the design aspect, because of the less standard elements of sewing. In fact, where were they made? Maybe I should find that out. I think they were made in Hong Kong. I think she has factories in China. Yeah, so I just checked. They were made in China, which is incidentally not where the cheapest clothes are made. And I guess the cheapest clothes are generally made in places like Bangladesh and other areas of Asia. I think Sri Lanka came up. I think Disney makes their clothes in Haiti. I think that was another story that came up as well. That might have been in the story of stuff. Fashionopolis also talked about Levi's in particular and their race to the bottom, their cutting corners in their production, offering lower prices. And so what was originally this kind of durable workwear brand became a kind of more fast fashion model. And I think in some elements, in some aspects, Levi's is trying to go back and offer more premium options with higher price points, but also more premium details, less cutting corners. And so that's one of the things that was featured in this book as well. It talked about how some of the dyeing processes could be done, or, there are ways that all these things can be done more organically, more locally, more sustainably. And it's just made difficult in so many ways for this to happen, so many kind of bureaucratic ways. And again, a lot of it's beyond the scope of my direct understanding, and so I don't want to misquote or kind of misrepresent anything here. Maybe I'll have to keep these and read them again in another 5 years and see what additional understanding I might have developed by then. Fashionopolis also labeled the false economy. And this is a point that I'm definitely taking with me into the future. So basically the false economy is where we can buy things at a lower price due to riskier work conditions and environmental destruction, but those are still costs that we have to pay for in some way, shape, or form at some point. And so the cost of lost lives, the cost of dyes being dumped into waterways or pollution from the factories, the cost of shipping products all over the world, and all of that somehow being better than producing in one locally operated, locally controlled factory, just because it can all be done for cheaper. But cheaper in dollars out of our pockets is not cheaper in impacts on the planet or the people. So again, to go back to that point about how conscious consumerism is not the answer to jobs overseas in these countries that need the labor, I have to disagree with that. And with all due respect, I think conscious consumerism is maybe the only answer in the ways that we can't condone these working conditions in other places that we would never condone down the street from us in our own neighborhoods. Providing that kind of job, is that really better than no job? And, you know, I get it. I'm not currently poor. I've not been to the poorer countries, but we have to do better. We can't, again, I'm not saying we need to pull out all the labor and bring it back local. I'm just saying that we have to have better standards for jobs that we contract overseas. We have to have more morality about it. If we wouldn't like it down the street from us or in our city, we shouldn't like it in Bangladesh. That is exploitation. And I think in the book Consumed, she also mentions how it just happens to be exploitation of people who are not white in most cases. So again, she pulls in the colonialism card. You know, all of these are, I guess, in some ways, all of these kind of production countries are countries that have been taken over or manipulated by white people. And I don't want to get too much into that right now either, because again, it's not something that I feel that I have enough expertise in, but it's just something that I've seen repeatedly coming up in all of these books about conscious consuming. And it's not brought up in a way to try to induce what I would consider white guilt either. Like, that's not how I read it in here. Maybe I'm biased because I'm not 100% white myself. I don't know. But I read it as a statement of facts. And, you know, I think all of these things are things that could probably be checked up on if we wanted to kind of verify what the history of each of these countries has been. But yeah, we can't allow factories to shirk environmental policies or labor practices. What's happening over there is still happening on planet Earth. And the pollution, the air being polluted in China and India is the air being polluted on our planet. And even if it's not in our immediate vicinity, there is some global consequence for that. Again, I'm not trying to throw the commenter who said that they need those jobs under the bus here, because I did honestly have to think about this a lot and use all these resources outside of my own information to be reassured that that is not the best answer, or that there are better options. And, you know, the commenter was right that I haven't been to a poor country or spoken with these people directly. And there are some circumstances where these people will say that I hope people keep on making orders so that we keep having a job. And as heartbreaking as that is, you know, the system needs to change. The system needs to reprioritize. And I think there are a lot of consumers that would appreciate that reprioritization. And I sincerely hope that it's not that all of us on the other side care so much about saving a few dollars that we wouldn't pay to give these people a slightly better life and better compensation for their actual labor. So I think the take-homes that I had from both of these books was that our attitudes towards clothing consumption needs to change. Maybe we can't change the whole global supply chain of fast fashion, and maybe we can't change what we can afford in a direct sense. But we can change how we look at how disposable clothing is. We can change how we treat fast fashion as a collective. It has to be treated as if it's not disposable. There are all kinds of statistics about how much clothing the US and the UK and other countries dispose of in textile waste per year. And we need to stop that. We need to not buy things that are just going to be disposed of. We need to not buy to the extent that we have to declutter things out of our closet every single year. And we just have to change our relationship with the things that we wear, the things that we bring into our lives as a whole. But especially for a lot of people, it does seem like fashion is one of those categories where we can justify bringing in one or two more things. And it's not something that, maybe society is just full of these narratives about style and personal style and trends and observing changes of seasons and trying something new and even kind of supporting other brands and influencers going crazy with their hauls. And we just see so many examples of why we should buy clothes, why we could buy clothes, why it's not bad to indulge in this kind of pastime of fashion as a hobby. And I just want to be a part of changing this attitude myself, and I would love to see this change happen in more people out there as well. If you don't need something new, don't buy it. And cheap clothing doesn't mean that we can or should treat it cheaply. It's not disposable. As I was editing the video, goodness, as I was editing the video that I did on the crunchy habits, how to be the right amount of crunchy granola, I was also struck by the fact that I didn't directly mention, but environmental pollution on Earth or textile waste on Earth is similar to how we use things in our own households, and we have a trash can. And, we take the trash out and it gets taken to a local dump or somewhere where the trash is stored. And this happening on a global scale is not so different than, the Earth is our home, right? The Earth is our largest unit of home. And so we have trash building up. And the more we create, the more, especially that doesn't biodegrade, the more long-term trash that the Earth, our home, has to store. So what if we never were able to take the trash out of our own homes and it was just accumulating and some of this stuff doesn't biodegrade, right? How long would it take for your rooms to be full of plastic waste? And if you dumped all your toxic waste, dyes and batteries and whatever other chemicals you use in your household, and if that just stayed in your local system, how long would it take for things to get polluted beyond repair? And the concept of these factories polluting like this and, factories that produce things that we buy. And again, I'm not saying it's our individual responsibility, or I'm still, somewhat at a loss as to what we can personally do about it besides being more conscious consumers, besides changing our attitude towards buying stuff. I find it one of those helpful exercises, I guess, to remind myself that trash over there, the clothes piling up in the desert in Chile, or the secondhand markets in Ghana that have all the clothing pallets of the bales of clothing that get sent there for resale, and a lot of it getting inevitably trashed when it's not able to be sold. Those clothes are piling up on our home, on planet Earth. It's not somewhere else. We live here. We all live on this planet. And so we all need to do our part in keeping it clean and not participating in practices that make that impossible. And so I guess that's the point to leave you with today. This has not been a very fun video, I guess. Sorry about that. I maybe catfished you a little bit because we started off with kind of a fun and silly reflection about how I wanted to get the identical sweatshirt to what I'm wearing at Costco, and I wanted to represent the cheap clothing. And now we've come to the point where clothing should not be cheap, and we should not be engaging in exploitative practices as much as we can personally control where our money goes. Okay, so editing self-inserting to say that there's always more to the story. There's always new developments and new things to learn. And I both got some comments on the Crunchy video and read some more of the story of stuff, got further in the book, and have additional thoughts of which I will expand upon further in more videos. But I did maybe uncover a little bit more about why conscious consumerism is still the answer in my mind, and why it might not be, actually. So maybe I do agree with this commenter if that's what they were getting at, even if I don't love how they laid out their point of view. And, honestly, if I'm going to be vulnerable here, I guess, I will also say that when people say things like, you've never been to a poor country, so you can't know, it does get my back up a little bit. And so, maybe I brought some of that baggage to my reception of that comment. I mean, I don't have the power to just go and learn all these things on the ground anyway. So I just don't feel like it's encouraging of people to try to learn things and appreciate things from all angles. Anyway, so I still don't know if I can agree with outsourcing labor or viewing certain countries as having cheap labor as their major export claim or value to other countries in a entirely positive light, since there's something about it that still feels like some kind of modern day slavery of minority peoples, as far as people that aren't the kind of people that reside in one country that's employing them for less than livable wages in their country. Sorry, I think I got cut off of my horizontal recording. My camera space is getting low. So, yeah, I don't have great vibes about that. In the story of stuff, they also shared that in Haiti, where they make a lot of the clothes for Disney, they used to have a much more self-sufficient system where they farmed rice. And again, I've also been alerted to articles that say subsistence farming in countries like this is worse, or is a worse job for more of the locals there, makes them struggle more. So I don't fully understand. There's a lot of things I don't understand, but the book definitely painted it as USAID came in and reorganized things so that Haiti would export labor again, these cheap goods, and stop growing their own rice, so that they had to import what they called Miami rice, even though it wasn't from Miami. And then when the price of the rice fluctuated, a lot of Haitians were left vulnerable and unable to afford food. And they'd also stopped growing it, so they couldn't provide it for themselves locally. And so that doesn't sound good either. And it also kind of suggests that there was foreign involvement there if USAID is the one that willfully set up that system. And so if these systems can be willfully set up, it also kind of speaks to me that perhaps these systems can be willfully improved or willfully regulated or willfully modified in a positive way. Again, I'm not saying that I believe in reshoring 100% of all these cheap manufacturing jobs. I'm not saying that the living wage is going to be equal over all these countries, or that the standard of living is even going to be the same. But I just think it's unconscionable that living standards can involve such dangerous situations and such inequality and lack of waste regulations. And again, I have some more sources. I've been pointed in the direction of more sources that I will browse, I will look into, I will consider very carefully and add to my own information on this topic before I revisit. And so, maybe that's what the commenter meant, as far as just not buying stuff is going to make life worse for some people. And maybe that's what they meant as far as conscious consumerism not being the answer. For me, conscious consumerism is not just not buying stuff, though. If it was, my channel would be much more simple and also probably more popular, honestly, because not buying stuff on a personal level is somehow more fun and more kind of maybe more relatable. But I just can't seem to help delving into these adjacent topics, these intersectional topics, I guess, that arise when thinking about one's consuming habits and the greater impacts of those. And so as far as the intersectionality goes, I do think conscious consumerism is a big part of the answer. And, maybe the answer is not buying stuff using cheap labor as a blanket rule. But, and if that's what that commenter meant, then maybe they're right in a sense. But I do think the mindsets that result from trying to be a more conscious consumer are necessary in trying to improve all the aspects of the situation that could and arguably should be improved. And in some cases, I do know that not partaking in the system can maybe be some kind of virtue signaling or some kind of way to, I guess, assuage our own guilt for participating in the system, whereas maybe boycotting or not participating is actually going to have trickle-down effects that are worse for the people on the other side. And obviously that's not what I'm trying to engage in or encourage either. And so, maybe more positive action is a better outcome or better thing to be pursuing in general than reduction of negative action. So, maybe it comes to a point where the no buy does pivot into how do we generate revenue to donate more. But then it does seem like I do have a bunch of Peter Singer books that I am going to read over the summer, hopefully when I have more time. And because that does kind of ring the bells of effective altruism. And I don't really have a great understanding of that either. So putting a pin in all of this, and there we go. The many facets of trying to be a conscious consumer. It's also possible that at some point I'll just step completely back from all this refocus it to just Project No Buy, focus on the fun individual challenge that this can be, and, not try to get involved in things that I am not going to be capable of having a full understanding of. We'll see. All right. Bye for now. See you in the next one. Back to the main video, I guess. Anyway, such is life. I will say bye for now and see you in the next one. As always, I would love to hear your stories in the comments below, or anything that I've said that has made you think, or maybe you disagree with, or maybe you think I got wrong. It's very possible. I am happy to engage with you and learn, as always, in the comments below. All right, bye for now, and I'll see you in the next one.